Hey guys, so welcome to the first actual bet sizing chapter where we're going to talk about how to play against clueless guys, and this is also going to include passive guys. And the main thing here is understanding a bit about how big of a bet what our hands actually want to do. This is something I've talked about in other places, not in this course, and I think it's fairly important. So the idea here is that whenever you look at a complete strategy, there is tons of deception. There are many layers of deception built in because we're trying to size for our range, right? If we sized every bet for our hand, our opponent would presumably be able to recognize this and react. But as you're playing guys who are clueless about bet sizing, these guys are going to be clueless about reading into your bet sizing, and therefore they're not going to react. And very often when you play against a weaker opponent, or a more passive opponent, or a trappy opponent, we're saying the Phil Hellmuth example again, although that's actually not giving him enough credit to put him in this category. So when we're playing against a player like that, it's very important that we understand what we want to do. Because, for example, let's say the board is king 6-4 and you have king deuce. Now it's the flop and you're against this guy who doesn't really know what he's doing. Do you want to bet? You want to check back? You want to bet half pot? You want to bet third pot? You want to bet 75%? What do you want to do? Or same spot with fives. Do you want to try to check it down? Do you want to put in a protection bet? Which street? What size? All of these are real questions to think about. In this instance, what we're really looking for from our opponent is just that he react honestly. Because in the examples I'm going to show, our opponent is not going to be capable of betting or raising himself. We'll take a look at that soon. No opponent is this extreme, but as long as your opponent is reacting honestly, if he's betting and raising only with hands that are stronger than yours, for example, then it's close to as though he's not betting and raising, because you can confidently understand his hand strength and fault. So anyone who's very tight, very honest, even if it's just in a certain node in a game tree, fits into this category in one way or another. Okay? So what we're going to do is look at what I like to call punching bag sims. So these are simulations of several board textures where your opponent is like a punching bag. So he can't react to what you're doing. He can't bet and he can't raise. And because he can't bet and can't raise, you actually get to see what your hands want to do, irregardless of your opponent. And the kind of caveats that you need to remember, how is this going to differ from reality? In these sims, our opponent never check raises. So our betting thresholds for getting 3 streets, we're not going to go as wide as maybe you're used to, because all of the 2 pairs and sets are still in his range. So you need to think, is that true or not? And sometimes add a bit of extra money compared to what we're seeing here. If you're on the river and your opponent hasn't raised, and the punching bag sim will say, you can only bet 25% pot. Maybe it's actually 50% or 75% if you think you can cap your opponent in some way. Also on the river, you will see very thin, very small bet sizes against punching bag opponents. And these only work if your opponent never bluff raises you. If he has a range that has value in bluffs, you can't value bet kind of to your heart's content. But a lot of guys don't, and this is actually how a lot of professional players approach sizing versus recreational players when you, the professional player, have the initiative. When you're looking at this, you always want to think in both directions. So as always, I'm saying for post-flop, you want to think in both directions, and maybe this is a good time to start tying pre-flop and post-flop and exploitative stuff together, because let's say someone is playing against you, and he is taking one of these lines that you recognize, and you think maybe he perceives you as a weaker player. Then you could be like, if you're doing 10-9-8 board, and you're betting half pot on the flop, and you think I'm a weak player, maybe it's a good time for me to check raise bluff you, right? Because you would go bigger with a good hand. Or even if it's a 9-6-3 board, and you're going like third pot, but I know that, you would go bigger with good hands because that you perceive me as weak. As we learn this stuff, we can always both use it ourselves, but also use it to read other players. So always think about both sides of the coin. Okay, so punching bag opponent. We're going to look at A7 deuce rainbow, button versus big blind, and see how the various hand categories that we have want to play. I put up to a pot-sized bet on the flop, even though there are textures where you would go bigger. This, for what it's worth, is not one of them. I think for simplicity's sake, so our brain doesn't explode, we need to put some limit on how deep we go, since this is just to learn some heuristics and bet sizing patterns. So A7 deuce rainbow, you can see a very commonly used size is quarter pot, 14. Pot here is 55. You can see on the left, you can see the bet sizes on the right. So very common to bet 14. And there's 28, half pot. 41 is 75% pot, and 55 is pot. You can see if you look at the colors, because each bet size correlates to a color, and in this instance, we're not going to focus on bluffs. We're going to focus on made hands. You can see that as the hands get weaker, the bet sizes get smaller. So on this board, they're very strongly correlated, where bigger hands bet more on the flop and smaller hands bet less, but there's still going to be stuff. There's still going to be stuff to learn about the patterns. So we're going to start with the big bet 55, which in terms of made hands is going to be sets, top 2, tiny bit of ace king. So we'll think about this as top 2 plus. These hands go pot the flop. If I put like an 8 of diamonds on a turn, they will now mostly pot the turn, sometimes overbet, and actually the preferred size is 200, which we don't have here. 200 would be what we call a geometric bet size. Geometric bet sizing means that we put the same proportion of money in to get all in by the river, and we put the same proportion on each street, so maybe 120% pot turn. Then you set up a 120% pot river shove. And this is the theoretical highest EV size when we're in a nuts versus bluff catchers situation, which is not the complete truth about this spot, but maybe it's close enough. So these hands go pot the flop, maybe a bit bigger, so 200 on a turn or 250, and then we get to a river like a 6. Deuces, 7s, aces shove, and ace 7 is no longer good enough to shove it. We'll bet quarter pot. Now, there is not too much to learn. There is, the fact that you just bomb with your really big hands, which has always been kind of common wisdom. When I started playing, one of the things that all the coaches would teach is that when you have a good hand, you want to start bombing from the flop. You didn't want nobody overbet back then, and I think even today, when you're playing against a weaker player, overbets have a scary psychological effect. So they would be, go 90% flop, 90% turn, then you set up nicely for a big river bet. And if you'd started flop with half pot bet, it's just very difficult to grow the pot without making big overbets. So start big, and the only kind of interesting thing about these hands is that the smallest bet was on the flop. That's, I guess, because the hands are so strong, you would want your opponent to catch up a bit, so flop would be the smallest size. Back to the flop, next hand type is going 75%. That's the top pair good kicker hand type. Ace king, ace queen, maybe a bit of ace jack. These go 75% flop. We're going to look at the similar run out. So 75% flop. They then go 50% on a turn, and then go 25% on the river. So you can see this here, 75, 50, 25. The idea here is that they are getting 3 streets of value, and the river bet is a large bet in terms of chips. But by the time they reach the river, because opponent's range is narrowed so much, they're not really very strong. They're not strong enough to make a big bet. And for example, if you went against someone who doesn't check raise, you went 75, 50, and just 75 again on the river, your equity with ace king would be 35%. So, you're getting called by too many 2-pair plus in your opponent's range. He gets to fold too many top pairs. Again, someone who doesn't check raise, and there are players like this, you have to be very, very careful how thin you value bet, or you just run into a brick wall of very strong hands. And I think the idea here is that we size bigger earlier on. So you might think, why not go 50-50-50? Why are we going 75-50-25? And the answer is that when we bet bigger on the flop or on the turn, we get our opponent to fold hands with equity. So, here we're getting our opponent to fold king 7 and queen 7. And you might ask, don't you want him to call those hands? And the answer to that would be, I do and I don't. I want him to call them if he's not getting pot odds, but I don't want to give him pot odds to call those hands by, say, betting 25% on the turn, where he's like, highly incentivized to call them and improve. I do gain some EV, by my opponent folding hands with outs against me. That is worth money in a real sense. So you rather get the folds earlier in the hand and then throw in the tiny bet on the river rather than tiny bets and then your opponent gets to the river with more hands and then you actually can't bet very big on the river anyway in the end. So 75-50-25, important pattern, an important concept to remember, because if we go back to king 4-6, now you have king queen against this guy. Maybe you understand that flop should actually be fairly big and then size down later. It's not a bomb hand, but if you're betting, might as well start a bit bigger. He'll say check all eights on a flop, and you size down and size down to keep his range wide enough where your hand is still effectively value betting. Next hand category is something like ace 10, ace 9, ace 8. These go 50-50-25. So similar structure, similar concept, not too much to say about those. Interestingly enough, if you look at eights, nines go in the same bucket as these hands. So they will also 50 the flop and then actually just check down. We have a 50-0-0 hand, getting the max protection. It is strong enough to bet 50%. It needs tons of protection, so it just goes for it as soon as possible and checks down. Look at king 7, kind of similar. We go 50, turn 5, mostly just check down, right? With no flush draw. We'll go check, check. River, no whatever. 10, doesn't matter. Check, check. So we have this hand category that's going 50-50-25, but also 50-0-0. It's not delaying the 50. It's not spreading it out. It's like, I want protection now. You have some vulnerable middle pair. You go up to the size that the hand is worth and then just check down after. Now, of course, in practice against a more sophisticated opponent, if you go bet 50, you get to the river, maybe he would lead out all his top pairs, and then maybe you would be able to value bet again on some runouts. But not against this opponent, and here we're just learning the heuristic, so just have to point that out so you guys don't start blindly following this against everyone. Next hand is weak top pair, like ace 5, or strong over pair, like tens through kings. These hands will tend to start with 25 and then continue with 25 and then check. So for example, 25 flop, say 8 the turn, maybe kings actually checks back. Not important why, but like king 8 plus, 9s plus. After going 25, all the ace-x will go 25 again. And then say river is a 3, villain checks. All the pocket pairs will check, and ace-x, maybe ace-6 is strong enough to on the 3, but say we make river a king. Yeah, just check back. So 25 check. So similar concept. The hands need less protection, so they will go more in the geometric direction. Now, in this instance, I want you guys to keep in mind the theory of geometric bet sizing means that if your hand is invulnerable, this is the best sizing to take. But the practice of poker is your hand is not invulnerable and you would rather get protection so your opponent doesn't improve as much. And these two things are at odds with each other. So as the hands get less vulnerable, they go more geometric, and more vulnerable, they go less geometric. Very, very natural way to go about it. And let me quickly show you guys the math for geometric bet sizings. Just something good to know. It's very easy to see. So we'll throw that in here in this Excel really quick. Okay, so the situation is this. We have 225 chips. pot is 100 chips, and we have 2 streets of betting. And this is what we call a poker toy game, the situation I'm describing. So one player will have nuts or air, and the other player will have only bluff catchers. So for this instance, we can say the board on the turn is deuce, deuce, 6, 6, or deuce, deuce, 6, 7, something like this. One player has quad deuces, so he's completely invulnerable as a value range. And he's going to have something like 6, 5 as a bluffing range, or, king, queen as a bluffing range. The other guy has aces. So, quads is always the best hand on the river. Aces is always the second hand. King, queen is always the third best. And one player has either the nuts or a bluff. The other guy always has bluff catchers. So this is a situation we're imagining. And our opponent defends enough to make us indifferent with our bluffs. That means that he has to defend at a frequency relative to our bet size so that we can't auto-profit by bluffing. What do I mean by this? Let's say I bet pot-sized bet, so I'm risking 100 chips to win 100 chips. If you fold over half the time, I auto-profit. This is called minimum defense frequency. It's a very basic concept. Those of you who know this part can obviously skip ahead, but it's not a nice kind of theory to have in your head. So the protection sizing would be to just open shove. The geometric bet sizing would be to go half pot, so the same on each street, and anything in between. You could go more protection, you could go 75-25, you could go more, I'll let my opponent improve, so 25-75. Of course, in this scenario, we don't need protection and we don't need our opponent to improve. So we're only thinking about geometric bet size, and I'll show you guys the math for why this works better. Okay, so let's say we bet 225 chips all in. He would need to prevent us from auto-bluffing, so we risk, let's look at our EV. For betting is going to be a risk minus fold times reward. So here, our risk would be minus 225 plus, we'll put the fold percent here, times the reward, which is 100 chips. Okay, so this is the EV for bluffing for us. And this would be the fold. So let's say our opponent folds half the time. Obviously, we're losing a lot because we're betting 2.25 times the pot. Say he folds 80% of the time. Minus 225. Yeah, here, and of course the reward is this plus 225. We get our bet back. So you can see at 80%, so here 50% of the time we're losing 62 chips. And as he folds more, folds more would be like this. So 0.6, we do better. 0.7, we do better. Now we're actually making money. And you can see how roughly around 0.69 to 0.7, we are breaking even. And then this would be our opponent's fold frequency. And so what's the EV for our value hands? Would be, say he folds 69%, so he calls 31%, so value wins 0.31 times the entire pot, which would be 325. So value hands would win, on average, 100.75 chips. Quickly make sure the math is okay. And of course, when they get folds, they would also win 100 chips. So value hands would win this amount of chips. Now we'll do the geometric bet size. So when we bet half pot, we're risking 50 to win 100. Our opponent needs to defend 2/3 of the time. So 1/3 of the time we win 100, 2/3 we lose 50. That evens out. So our opponent needs to defend 2/3 of the time on each street, and then so what's the EV for our value bet? So the EV for betting is going to be like this. So opponent calls, folds first time. It will happen 34% of the time. He's going to fold to the first bet. And we're going to win 100. The rest of the time, so 66%, he's going to either fold to the second bet, And here we won 100 plus the first bet, so we won 150. Or he's going to call both bets. And here, this is 64, and we win 325. His second bet is another 75 chips. Make sure again the math is okay. Sorry, we win 225. And this should be, so correcting this to 225, because we don't win our own chips here. So to look at this again, either our opponent folds flop, we win 100, or the rest of the time, if he folds turn, we still win the flop bet. And if he calls both streets, so 64% of the time, we're going to win another 75%. And yeah, when you look at these two numbers, you see a difference of $24. You can also think about it as a difference of 20% almost. So very big difference in EV for this situation for a geometric bet size. And so reason that you're going to see some spots where geometric bet size is the best strategy, but you always want to think about, like, do I need protection? That's going to give me an incentive to go another way. And do I need my opponent to catch up? And that's also going to give me an incentive to go another way. Just sidetracking to geometric bet size. So yeah, we were going for all the hand types. We looked at those. You can see the low pairs, so 7-5 or pocket threes. These go 25, and then on improved they will just mostly check down. Maybe throw in a small protect. This is just with diamonds, so the hand has more EV. But yeah, just check down after going 25 flop. And yeah, that's kind of all we can learn about ace-high boards. But it does have a lot of kind of bet sizing heuristics mixed into it. Now, before we jump to the next board, I wanted to show you guys what changes when it's big blind versus UTG, just for reference, because of course we're going to have different positions. And the answer is the structure stays the same, where hands will have similar incentives, but the thresholds will change. So on the left, the good aces are ace-queen and ace-king. On the right, it's just ace-king that's betting big. On the left, the next tier of aces goes maybe down to ace-9 and some ace-8. On the right, it's just down to ace-jack, maybe some ace-10. On the left, maybe 8s and 9s can go half-pot. On the right, they're not good enough to half-pot. On the left, 3s and 4s go for protection. On the right, they're actually like low enough in our range that we maybe turn them into a bluff. So all the thresholds are different for the in-between hands. Like you need a better kicker to go big. You need a higher pocket pair to go big. Makes sense, but all the structures and the incentives are going to stay the same. Next sim is 7-6-5 two-tone. So very, very different board. And here kind of first thing that should jump out at you is that there are no small flop bets. Reason being that the small flop bet just doesn't do enough on this board. If you bet flop small, your opponent, even though he's a punching bag, remember punching bag opponents are going to tend to not be able to continue a lot because they're not getting big implied odds by, check raising you or whatever. Like they can't value bet themselves. So they have to be a bit tighter. And another reason why some of these value bets are so tight by the river and why in practice you get to go a bit bigger. Yeah, in terms of structure, the bet is just too small for this board. Everything is going to have a draw or a pair or two over, so almost nothing folds. So bets tend to be 75 to pot. There are mixes, but it is clear something like queens is going to go 75% most of the time. Something like 8-9 is going to go more pot than not. And generally we can assume, king 7 is going to go 75. So the more medium strength bets will go 75. And yeah, what can we see looking through this sim? Already wrote the summary, but I want to go through these quickly with you guys. So something like top pair, that's going to be queens or a7. These hands before the good top pairs went 75, 50, 25. Here, it's going to be tough to get a run out that's very bricky, but you can see 75 followed by mostly 50. And then say 10 river. And they then go mostly 25. So the equivalent of the good top pair hands, which here would be an over pair or something like a7, will go 75, 50, 25. More medium top pairs might go 75, 50 check. So where before they went 50, 50, 25, here they go more 70. There is no 50 flop. So they go 75, 50 check right? To get the extra protection, you need more protection here. So that makes sense. If we have something like a straight, like 8-9, of course we're going to go, say, pot the flop, 2 on the turn, and we're going to keep going fairly big, so more geometric-ish sizing. If we have something like a set, also pot the flop often, but then actually just pot the turn, and again, trying to put brickish run out, and then you can't shove river with a set, it's not good enough. You go like pot, pot, half pot. So again, the size down happens on the river, but it's more extreme. It goes from 100 to 50. And yeah, again, say you went pot, pot, pot against someone who's not check raising, your equity with sets would still be above 50. But, why not go better? And you can imagine the math equation works better for pot, pot 50, and then you get called by a lot more hands. And your equity on the river is 67 rather than 60. Just wins more EV. We're going to have to trust the computer on this. Say flush comes in. So we went pot, and now it's a queen of hearts flush. And we have something like a straight or a set. What you'll see is just a size down. So these hands keep betting, but they are now devalued. So something like straight would go pot into 25% into 50, actually. So more on the river. My theory is that this is to make sure it doesn't come a 4 flush. But yeah, set would go 25-25, so just size down. I think this is very coherent, very logical way to play. Kind of something interesting that comes up when the board is very connected is that you will see some hands betting that while they have extra equity in the form of a draw, it doesn't feel like the hand maybe belongs in a bet size. So, for example, after going 75% flop, you would see something like 8-5 of clubs going half pot turn, where, after you bet and get called, 8-5 will have 33% equity. This might remind you of the river ace-9 thing that we looked at before, where a hand is betting and getting called and doesn't have very good equity, and it's a bit surprising. Like, do you actually need that much protection? Because you could do the same with maybe a 10-7 hand type. The 10-7 never bets that size or any size. So why is this hand betting? So on the one hand, there are implied odds, but there is something a bit extra going on, which is pretty cool to see. And that's that if you bet something like 4-5 or 8-5 on a very connected board, you have this cool effect where your opponent will on the one hand call you with ace-8 and ace-high flush draws and maybe his pocket 4s, and on the other hand he'll fold some 6s. So when we look at the equity of a value bet, we're used to thinking, we need it to be above a certain threshold because our opponent is presumably constructing his calling range in a linear fashion. But when the board's very connected, this doesn't happen, and that does lead to you sometimes wanting to make these pair plus draw type of bets, kind of adds extra oomph to those. Okay, so sets, nuts, and flush draws. Yeah, I think that's enough for 5-6-7 board. Jack 5 has no potting. I think that's the first interesting thing. And all the boards up to now had potting, but Jack 5 has the strongest blocker effects. And what you'll see here is that something like Ace Jack will go 75 into 75 into 75. And you might think good trips are good enough to go bigger. Now, obviously, they don't need much protection, although they do enjoy getting some protection from flush draws. But the reason they can't really go bigger is just that there's too strong of an interaction where if you start betting really big, your opponent doesn't need to call you much wider than a jack. And when you're holding one of the jacks, that just makes it, and there are already 2 out there, that his calling range shrinks very, very quickly. So you start betting very big. Just turns into an issue again because of the removal effect. So let's say we were to shove river and with ace jack and get called, you can see we're at 51 to 55% equity, which is not nearly as good as ace jack needs. So ace jack can do much better, even though it's strong enough to shove, right? Like a geometric bet size type situation. It's not the actual nuts, and there are removal effects, so this is very different from the geometric toy game. We go kind of geometric size, but we're not aiming for stacks, we're aiming for a much smaller number. So good trips will go like that. Worse trips, so something like jack 6, will actually go, interestingly enough, 50 into clicking so you guys can see. I know I do it a bit fast, you can always pause the video, but I'm telling you guys the size anyway. So it goes 50 into 50 into 50. So it's going with the same concept of geometric bet size, 50, 50, 50. It doesn't need much protection. It's not like I don't want my opponent's ace 5 or whatever to suck out to 2 pair, or like you can go 50, 50, 50, same across 3 streets. But you can't start building the pot too much, or the strong blocker effects make it so your hand isn't good enough against someone who's not check raising and who's maybe slightly overfolding early streets. High pocket pairs, something like aces, kings. These would start out 25, and then they actually size 50. First time we've seen this, right? In terms of structure, it was always big to small. Here they go 25 flop, 50 turn, and then if we get some really bricky river, they will then 25 again. So 25, 50, 25. Makes a ton of sense to me looking at this, because when I have aces, there's a certain amount of money I want to put in, but I want my opponent to improve. This is why a lot of people might even consider checking back aces on jack, jack 5 against a real opponent. There is a certain amount of money you want in. It's not big enough where you have to start betting flop or it gets too hard, but you want your opponent to improve, so you want to give him a chance, so you make the small bet or the check back on the flop against a real opponent, then start sizing up turn to get the flush draw value and protection, and then another small bet on the river. Again, look how weak aces is. So lots of players who don't know this look at aces, they're like, aces, let's pot the flop. And once you've potted the flop, you're already down to 64% with aces. If you now half pot the turn and you get called, you're down to 53. So you've already killed all the value of your hand just by going pot half flop. So yeah, there are lots of trips on jack, jack 5. It's very different from something like jack 5, 5. This is just in terms of the ranges. So that's high pocket pairs, and then low pocket pairs will actually go different. So something like 8s or 9s or 7s or 6s or 4s will actually go 50, 25, 0. So 7s will go bigger because it does want the protection, right? We're always comparing the three things that our hand wants. Does it want geometric bet size, maximum value? Does it want protection, money as soon as possible? Or does it want its opponent to catch up and less worried about maximum value, and then you go small into big? So these are kind of the three patterns that we're seeing in terms of bet size that we're learning from the punching bag sims. Yeah, I think that does it for jack, jack 5, 9. Obviously, like you can expect, say a flush came in, all the hand categories would shift down in terms of how much money they put in. So good trips wouldn't go 75, 75, 75. Would shift down the sizings. We don't need to see the exact amounts here. Okay, so last sim we're going to look at is a really cool one. Jack 8, 5, two-tone. Here, the really cool thing is that by far the most dominant flop sizing is pot. And we see it with hands as weak as Jack 7. So here we're really much more we don't want our opponent to catch up. We want protection. Different from the other boards where if a flush comes in, you lower your bet size. Here the board is so dynamic. Say a 7 comes in, it's like straight comes in, but also a pair plus straight comes in, and two pairs come in, and so many cards come in that change the value of our hand that we really want to get the money in as soon as possible. So here, say we pot, our opponent calls, and just for an example, look at a 9. A 9 would slow us down quite a lot. So you might go pot with, say, something like ace jack. into half pot turn on the 9, into quarter pot on the river, pot, half pot, quarter pot, so more extreme reduction. But if we make it more bricky, we go, say, pot, and we have a deuce on the turn, you might see kings now going for an overbet turn, and then even if the river is something bricky like a 3, they would then go, oh, just quarter pot the river. So pot, overbet, quarter pot. And here I expect if we let the program overbet flop, it probably would. The board is so dynamic, we don't want our opponent to catch up. We have very poor visibility over what's going on, that our strong hands just get money and fast, and slow down later. So, yeah, kings goes pot overbet 25, top pair no kicker will go pot 50 check. Weak pairs go 25-25 check or 25 check. Medium pairs a bit more, so 50-25 check. But again, we're seeing a more extreme, like every board where we have these 3 things to think about. Are our value hands invulnerable? Here, hell no, they're super vulnerable. So we want to start really big and not like ace-jack previously, jack-jack 5, 75. We're gonna go probably overbet check if we're given the option to. So that does it for the punching bag sims. Hopefully you guys learned a thing or two about bet sizings and incentives. And like I said, other side to this is when you see Jack 8-5 and someone bets and you're playing against someone who has a variety of different bet sizes, you realize that if he had something good, he has a very big incentive to bet flop big. And when he bets flop medium, probably doesn't have something good, and you can use that knowledge to your advantage. Similarly, Jack 5, when you're against a smart opponent, he's probably never gonna pot with a jack, because he has a lot of incentive to let you catch up and let you improve. So very level 1, bet size equals hand strength opponent would pot trips, but the guy who's more thinking about what he wants you to do would always bet trips smaller and maybe pot a bluff because he wants you to fold. So kind of stuff to keep in mind. Hope you guys enjoyed the chapter. I will see you in the next one.